So this presentation is going to give you some of the basics on organizational culture. And I want to do this so you can go into your organizations and understand culture better and learn how to look for the clues. I want you to be a detective. When you go into your organizations, whether you're going in for an interview or you're going into a new job or you're just going in for the day, you can look around and try to figure out what is the culture of this organization like. So these are some of the things that sometimes people say about their jobs. I just didn't fit in. The company's values aren't my values. This place is too rigid, too competitive, too formal, or too laid back. I really feel at home. Or the way they do things makes no sense. All these things reflect interacting with the culture of an organization. So what is culture? It's really the set of shared, taken for granted, implicit assumptions. So that means assumptions that are not stated out loud, they're not written anywhere. They're things that just people take for granted, but they're not expressed. So these assumptions that a group holds and that determine how it perceives, thinks about, and reacts to its various environments. So culture is a shared understanding of what actions and symbols mean, and that shared understanding really governs how the organization interacts with the environment, how it reacts to events, how the people within it behave. So what does culture do for people within an organization? So the first thing it does is it differentiates. It provides a shared identity. It tells the people in an organization who they are. Who are we compared to the people that are not in this organization? What makes us special? What do we believe? What do we value? And that provides some cohesiveness. It motivates members by facilitating commitment. If they are a good fit with the culture, if the culture is something that they believe in, they're going to be more committed to it. It facilitates coordination by having these values that really tell people within the organization how to react, how to behave. It means that things are predictable. It means that things are stable, and when you have things that are stable and predictable, it's easy to organize. It's easier to coordinate because you know what's going to happen. You know how people are going to react. You know what's important. You know what's not important, and that just makes the coordination that much easier. And finally, culture shapes behavior. So when you have these shared values and assumptions about what's useful, what's important, that really tells you how to behave. This is especially true when you have what's called a strong culture. This is when the values are widely shared and strongly felt. So people really, really strongly believe in them, and most people in that organization share those beliefs. I like to show this picture as an example of a cultural artifact. This is not really about an organization, although it is in part. This is really about the city of Philadelphia. I went to Philadelphia and stayed there for 2 weeks a couple of years ago. And I went to the observation deck that's at the top of One Liberty Place, which is the tallest building in Philadelphia. So this is a place where tourists go. They're showing off the best of Philadelphia to people from outside the city. And when I was there, I saw this. This was a little sound booth that you went in, and they had hockey sounds were playing over these speakers, and this is what I looked at. It says, "Win or lose, we still brawl." And I thought this is a perfect cultural artifact for the city of Philadelphia. So this is in reference to the Philadelphia Flyers in the mid-70s. They were called the Broad Street Bullies, which you can read if you can read what's on this in the slide. The Broad Street Bullies were a team that they won the Stanley Cup twice, and they were really known for going out and beating the crap out of their opponents on the ice, physically. Not just beating them with the score, but with their fists. And so this is something, if you see win or lose, we still brawl. This is saying we are proud of our fighters. We are proud of these guys that went out and kicked the hell out of the other teams with their fists, with their feet, with whatever. That's what we're proud of. We don't even care if they won or lost. I mean, they care that they won. They were happy about that, but that's not what they're celebrating. They're celebrating the fighting. And so even within the idea of hockey being a sport with a lot of fights, this team, the Broad Street Bullies, this is the Philadelphia Flyers, this was something to be celebrated. So the fact that, at this point, I think we were not quite, I guess, 40 years after, they're still celebrating this team and their fists. And I just thought this was really funny, and I thought very characteristic of Philadelphia. I lived there for 4 years. I love Philadelphia, but they pride themselves on being kind of a tough city. And that is also reflected in what is now the mascot of the Flyers, Gritty. So, what I love about Gritty is that if you read Gritty's biography, it specifically says Gritty's father was a bully, and that is a direct reference to the Broad Street Bullies, the Philadelphia Flyers in the mid 70s. And so I think you can see that this is for an organization, right? So, win or lose, we still brawl is Philadelphia. We're proud of the Flyers. And this is the Flyers organization saying we're going to pick a mascot that reflects us. We're going to carry on our heritage of being proud of this team, that we're so violent that even the Soviet team didn't want to play them. They were known for going out and fist fights on the ice and just beating the hell out of everybody. So Gritty also is a cultural artifact that ties into this overall culture for the Philadelphia Flyers and Philadelphia as a whole. It just was a funny thing for me to see going in as a tourist who had previously lived in Philadelphia for 4 years, many years ago, seeing what was being celebrated. And this was something that, Philadelphia is saying we're proud of. This is another example of a cultural artifact. I went to a banquet, and my table was the top table. You can see the cups are plastic cups, like plastic tumblers that you'd get at Party City. You can see that everything on the table is really close together. There's not a lot of room. On the bottom is the head table. So this banquet took place at a church. So at the bottom table, there was the priest, there was the archbishop, there was the priest's wife, there were our guests of honors, and that was their table. And when I got there, I immediately snapped those two pictures because I thought, again, these are cultural artifacts. This tells you something about the organization. So what does it tell you? I have plastic tumblers. That's the top picture. The bottom picture, the head table, you see cut crystal glasses, both for water and for wine. Everything is a little more spread out. It's a little bit tough to tell, but it's a little more spread out. They have more room. At my table, we were packed in elbow to elbow. Not so at the head table. It was a larger table. You can't see the flower arrangement on my table, but it was small and simple, and you can see it's larger and more elaborate on the head table. We all had these regular banquet chairs, which you can see on the bottom, kind of in the background on the left, that bottom picture, you can see that's a regular banquet chair. But at the head table, there was one chair that was brought special from somewhere else in the church that was more plush. It had arms. That was the archbishop's chair. So when you look at these two tables and all these differences between the table that I was at and the head table, that tells you some things about the culture of the organization. One is that they are very hierarchical. So it's not just that if you have status in this organization, you have nicer glasses, you have more room to eat. They're also served first, which the picture doesn't tell you. But even within that table, the archbishop, who is the highest ranking dignitary, had the nicest chair, the cushiest chair. They had the nicest flowers. So that tells you that, the hierarchy is, people are very comfortable with that. So there is a lot of power distance. It tells you that even within the hierarchy is very important. It tells us we're not afraid of that, that this is part of this organization, is that, the differences in status are recognized and, celebrated, perhaps. It's something that's very important. So that I thought was a really interesting clue just by looking at the physical things that we see, and those are artifacts. These are artifacts that you can see that are observable, that give you clues to the culture. So if you go in for an interview at an organization, you can see, where do people park? Are there reserved parking spots for people? You go in, you see the offices, who has the nicest office space, who has the cubes, who has the corner office. That all tells you things. Who is on the walls? Sometimes you can see that if they have, long-serving employees on the walls, you can see who's important, who are the myths and legends in this organization about. These are all things that you see that give you clues. So these are artifacts. They are observable, and that is your first level of culture. The first thing you see when you go in and you're trying to figure out what is a culture is all about. That is the top layer. The next layer, here's some more artifacts. I teach at Boston College, and Boston College is a Jesuit school. It's a Catholic school. And so you see artifacts on campus that are representative of the Jesuit tradition, that are representative of the culture at Boston College. So on the left, you see Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, which is Latin for to the greater glory of God, which is the Jesuit motto. This is above the door of one of the big rooms in the main building in the center of campus, Gaston Hall. And on the right, you see a statue of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit movement. And that is also a very prominent statue on campus. So you see other things on campus that are these physical representations saying this is what's important to us, this is part of our culture. The other thing that Boston College has is that if you go into a classroom, any classroom, there's usually a crucifix. Maybe there's an icon, but a religious icon, but most of the classrooms have crucifixes. And I will tell you, when I was there for the first time teaching several years ago, I went in not really knowing that much. I knew it was a Jesuit school, I knew it was a Catholic school, but I walked into my classroom on the first day of the first semester and I looked and saw a crucifix over the door of the classroom, and I thought, they mean business here. This isn't just lip service. They're so serious about it that they're putting crucifixes in the classroom to remind us all this is a Catholic school. And I think that actually is true. I think these artifacts that they've put up that were a conscious effort on the administration. They're relatively new. They're there within the last 15 years. They decided to put crucifixes in the classroom, put more religious iconography around campus. They put the statue of St. Ignatius of Loyola as a way to say, here are these physical things to remind us all that this is what we're about. So this is our first layer of culture, the artifacts. The next layer of culture is the espoused values. These are explicitly stated values and norms that are preferred by an organization. You can often find these if you go to an organization's website. They often have, maybe it's on the careers page. A lot of times that's where you'll find it. And there'll be an about us or our values or our culture. And they'll say outright, these are our values. These are the things that we believe in. They'll describe their own culture. So that's great. They're telling you these are things that we say that are important to us, that we say that we believe. The trouble is sometimes there's a gap between what they say they believe and what they actually believe. So the next layer down is enacted values. The enacted values are, what does the organization actually believe? Sometimes there's a gap. Not always, but sometimes. So here's an example of a gap you might see. An organization might say something like, we are strongly committed to work-life balance for our employees. So that might be an espoused value. You might find that on their website. And then you come to find out that if you are a man who's just had a child, it's difficult or impossible to get paternity leave. Or if you take paternity leave, you get punished. Maybe you don't get that promotion that year, or your raise is smaller. That's happened to people that I know. That's happened to men that I know. And so in that case, there would be a gap between your espoused values and your enacted values. Sometimes there's not a gap. One of Disney's espoused values is that they believe in optimism. They believe in uplifting, optimistic stories for people of all ages. So when I was watching the movie Big Hero 6 with my family, I don't want to spoil it, but at one point it looks like there might not be a happy ending. you are thinking, this is not ending well. And I turned to my husband and I said, one of Disney's corporate values is optimism and happy endings. I said, this movie is going to have a happy ending. I don't know how, but it's going to have a happy ending because that's what they believe in. And I was right. So that's a case where the enacted values, and if you do watch Disney movies, they tend to have happy endings. This is before Empire Strikes Back, before they bought Empire Strikes Back. I don't know what they would have done if they were redoing Empire Strikes Back, but uh, the enacted value and the espoused value, in that case, there's not a lot of distance. So in that case, you have to look at not what the organization says, but what do they do? Who gets rewarded? Who has power? Who has status? You know, that's what you see when you are looking for the enacted values. Underneath those enacted values, the next layer that is providing the foundation for everything else are these basic assumptions that are not always said out loud. They're often enacted as norms. So norms are rules of behavior. You can have low intensity norms. These are not considered very important. Uh, it might be, coming late to a meeting, or maybe dressing a particular way or not dressing a particular way. These are low intensity norms. They are not necessarily considered very important. The sanctions might be something like a snide remark or a raised eyebrow. Nothing very serious. Then you have high intensity norms. High intensity norms, if people break them, they are severely punished or they're expelled from the organization. You have to ask yourself which actions in this organization produce a lot of shock and anger, or might produce a lot of shock and anger, and those are your clues as to what the high intensity norms are. So the rules of behavior are ways that these basic assumptions are expressed. So within an organization, you're always going to have people that can break some of these low and moderate intensity norms. Those folks have idiosyncrasy credits. So these idiosyncrasy credits give you the freedom to violate some of these less important norms. You usually still can't violate the high intensity norms, but low and moderate, showing up to meetings late, dressing a little funky, that kind of thing. Being able to violate those norms often is related to the status that you have. So if you are somebody that makes important contributions to an organization and you're bringing high status to the organization, or any other contribution that people within the organization see as valuable, you're going to have these idiosyncrasy credits. So let's go back to being a detective. If you're in an organization, you're watching people trying to get the lay of the land, sometimes you see people breaking rules. The folks who break the rules, that tells you what the organization thinks is important. So if a scientist with a lot of valuable patents gets away with screaming at a lot of people, but somebody with fewer patents doesn't get away with that, that tells you, okay, this organization really values having patents, because somebody with these patents, with a lot of patents, that's brought a lot of value to the organization in that way, is able to violate a norm of civility. But other people are not able to violate that norm. So that gives you a clue. The important thing to understand is that that scientist who's screaming at people that has a lot of patents usually still has to obey the high intensity norms of his or her field. So the norms regarding careful scientific experimentation, honest reporting of results, academic integrity, breaking those norms can still lead to really severe punishment or sanctions or getting kicked out of the organization. So in those cases, in these high intensity norms, even your status might not save you. They might, depending on what the norm is, depending on whether that norm, breaking that norm, threatens the existence of the organization. If it doesn't, or has the potential not to, you're more likely to have that person get away with it. But in general, these really high intensity norms, even high status people generally have to follow them. So culture is difficult to change. We know this. I was just watching the Netflix documentary on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And one of the things that came out is not only that the O-rings were a problem, but there was cultural reasons why this decision got made, why this information was ignored, why the engineers at Morton Thiokol, the engineering firm that had built the solid state booster rockets, were ignored. And there was a whole presidential commission and a report, and NASA fixed the O-rings. Morton Thiokol redesigned them, made them better, made them reliable. And then in 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up upon re-entry. And the work that and the reports into that disaster essentially found very similar processes. So it was a different problem. The O-rings were fine. This was the thermal heat shield tiles that came off, and that's why the shuttle broke up upon reentry. But something that they knew was a problem, just like they knew the O-rings were a problem, and NASA had been ignoring it. So same exact process, even though the folks in charge at Challenger had all they'd been gone through early retirement, or they had been moved out, or they eventually left. Because of that, it's like the same stuff going on, And so culture is incredibly hard to change, even with something that was a huge crisis, terrible PR, really threatened the existence of NASA. It still was not enough to really get them to change their processes at this core level. So why is it that culture is so hard to change? There are a few different things going on. One is the founder effect. So when a founder starts up an organization, they bring with them their values. And those values govern their behavior, govern their decisions, and the decisions that they make about how to structure the organization bakes those values into the organization. So the structures that they build, who gets promoted, how many people do we have, what departments do we have, what does the physical space look like, where are we located? These things all reflect the founder's values. And then those values become the organization's values. And once you have those structures, the structures are hard to change. It's not that you can't change them, but they're more difficult to change. The founders also create those formal espoused values. They're the ones that are writing them. They're the ones that are saying, this is what is important. If you look at Lululemon's manifesto, the founder really created that, and you can see it's been changed a little bit over the years. Some of the more outlandish pieces, now that the founder is no longer at all associated with Lululemon, some of the more outlandish pieces have changed, but the manifesto is still there. A lot of the pieces are still the same, and that is really Lululemon's formal espoused values that Chip Wilson, the founder, created, and that are still, by and large, probably 80% of them are still there. The founder designs the physical spaces, designed the reward systems. These all serve to reinforce the values that the founder has brought into the organization and baked into how the organization runs. The founder can also set up mentoring and role model relationships. And this also tells you, who does the founder think is worth mentoring? Who are the role models? How do we foster talent in this organization? Deciding who gets those resources reflects the values. And if the founder has designed those structures, that's going to perpetuate those values in the culture, because who they pick, what they value is going to reflect the culture. Then those people are going to be developed into talent and get power within the organization and start running things, and they will perpetuate that culture. Socialization is another way that organizations perpetuate their culture. So this is now at many organizations called onboarding. This used to be called new hire orientation. I have heard that onboarding is used slightly differently than new hire orientation, but a lot of organizations are using it in that same way. So just know what that means, that's what onboarding means. It's new hire orientation, essentially. It's bringing people into an organization. Sometimes it's used for bringing people onto a project, but they're socializing them. They're telling them this is what the culture is about. This is what it's like to work here. These are the things you need to know. Some organizations have very extensive socialization processes. Think about boot camp for the military, where you're there for over a month. You're isolated, and they are really working hard to socialize you and get you ready for the values and the culture that you are going to experience when you go out into that whatever branch of the military you are in. Other organizations have very short socialization processes, maybe a day, maybe a week. Disney has Disney University, so that's a more extensive socialization process. The other reason it's hard to change culture is that everything is interdependent. If you have everything is based upon these implicit assumptions, you can change one thing. Maybe you can change the way you do mentoring, or you can change your reward system, but there's going to be 100 other things that are relying on that same value. And if you don't change all of them, it's going to be difficult. If you change all of them, you still have that underlying attitude and things are going to crop up. It's hard to change attitudes. It's hard to change values. And so, having that interdependency means you can't just change one thing and have it be fixed. And because you have these shared attitudes and values that are underlying everything, it's really, really hard to change. It's easier to change individual attitudes, but shared attitudes are extremely challenging to change. The best and most effective way to change shared attitudes is to have discussions with others, but that's really time intensive and it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. And finally, culture perpetuates itself in an organization. So on the right, you see I have this, what I call the attraction, selection, retention cycle. So if we start with attraction, if you're in an organization, you already have some kind of culture. People don't necessarily apply to a company without doing any kind of investigation. And so if they've heard anything about the culture, they are evaluating, do I think that this would be a good place for me to work? And if they think that they're not a fit with the culture, they won't even apply. An investment banking firm, you often have to work just hours and hours and hours a week, 100 hours a week. If that's not something you want to do, if you don't think that hard driving, work all day, all night culture is something that you want, you're not even going to apply. So at the attraction level, it's weeding out people that are not going to fit with the culture. People that might get into the culture and try to change it. So you're only getting people at the attraction that level that are probably going to support and uphold the culture. So, but let's say some of those people that maybe aren't going to be the best fit apply, they get through, they're in the selection process. So they're being interviewed, people are deciding whether or not to bring them into the organization. And if they don't think that you're a good fit with the culture, they often won't hire you. So you're getting weeded out there again. One thing to understand is that culture fit in the selection process often ends up being a tool to exclude people who are coming from diverse backgrounds, people who are coming from, maybe different schools, have different ethnic backgrounds, just because it's easy to say that a culture fit is somebody who looks like us. So this is a pitfall, right? You may want to think about, Adam Grant says you might think about what is a person, rather than is this person going to fit our culture, think about what is this person going to contribute to our organization instead, and not focus on that culture fit. But but the way that organizations normally handle it with the selection process, again, you're weeding out people that are not going to fit in with the culture. Let's say some of those sneak through though, and now they're working there. The longer you're there, you're not fitting in with the culture, you don't like it. It's very difficult to change a culture while you're there. They're going to leave. They're not going to be retained at this organization, either voluntarily or involuntarily. They're going to leave. And so all along the way in this cycle, you're losing people that could come in and make a change to the culture, but you're getting rid of them at every step of the way. And so what you're left with is people that like the culture that don't want to change it. So that's something to really think about in an organization, especially if you're trying to change the culture in favor of having a more diverse and inclusive culture, how does this cycle negatively impact? Is there a way to possibly break it or get people off this circular track? So what are the things that I want you to take away from this? The first thing is to be a detective. It's incredibly important to go into an organization and really be able to figure out what's going on here. How am I going to be successful? What's the culture? Just know how things work. Know what you need to do. Understand, is this a place where you can thrive? Be able to look for the problems. Be able to look for things that you think might not be so fantastic, because the companies are not going to tell you. You have to figure it out yourself. But I think, when you see the clues, you look at the artifacts, you look at the espoused values, you look at the actual behaviors that reflect the enacted values, and then you think, well, what does that all mean for what are the assumptions underlying this? You can sometimes get a good picture. Sometimes it takes you a while. You might need to be there for years, but you can often get at least a partial snapshot. You want to look for those layers. You want to think about, what do I see on the surface? What does that mean? What are they saying? What does that mean? Is what they're saying really lining up with what they do? And what does what they do mean? And what does that mean for what's important? And by doing that, you are able to better evaluate, is this going to be a good place for you? If you're going in as an outsider, as a consultant, if you're thinking about power and persuasion, understanding the culture of an organization, that can help you tailor your approach. And finally, really understanding that culture impacts everything, and it's really hard to change. It's not impossible to change, but it's very hard to change. And so knowing that also, I think, can help you think about, if you are going in to make a change, what are the pieces that might be most successful? Are there places that you think are working? Are there values that you think are working? Can you build on that? Can you maybe think about the interconnectedness of some other things where, okay, if we change one thing, what else are we going to have to change? What's the problem? How can we build in structures that are going to reflect the new values that we think are important? So I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about organizational culture and helps you think about how to approach an organization and really how to diagnose a culture when you're coming into it for the first time.